Lovely, thank you, Joe. Yes, so just to run a few things. My name is indeed David. So I work at the University of Oxford for Study Hire. I've been working for Study Hire for a couple of years now, doing lots of outreach with schools and so forth. And I've been hanging around universities for quite some time, and I've got several degrees from universities in the UK. We will be talking about applying to university today. Hopefully we'll be able to get through everything. It's quite a lot to get through. I'm trying to sort of strip it down to the essentials that you really do need to know. If I sound a bit echoey and look a bit like I haven't stopped, that's because I'm hiding in the garage today, because 7 o'clock is my 3-year-old's bedtime. So I thought I'd spare you all the sort of ruckus that can come about as a result of that. So yes, that might be why I'm looking a bit like I'm in the cold, because I am. Alice, we have Alice with us today. Alice is a student at the University of Oxford. She's got a wealth of experience and is really lovely, and she's offered to come along today as well. Alice, please do feel like you can just unmute and speak at any time. Don't feel like you need to wait for me to refer things over to you. Would you like to just introduce yourself to the attendees today?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Alice. I'm in my second year of studying law here at Oxford. And when I came in to apply to university, no one in my family had done it before. I was clueless, my guardian was clueless. So hopefully I can give some good insight from what we learned when we were doing this exact same process.
Lovely, thank you, Alice. And obviously, you'll all have heard from Joe already. Joe will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A panel. So if you have any questions for us, please do put them in the Q&A. I think as well you might have access to the chat, and in which case please do, if you do need to message us that way. I think you should also be able to raise your hands at the end. We should have time for questions if you want to stay behind, and at that point we can stop the recording and you can raise your hands, and we can give you permissions to unmute and come on camera if you should wish it, but that's okay. Joe, have you had a chance to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, so I'm just Joe. So I work for Study Hire. I'm one of the higher education liaison officers based in Swindon. So yeah, I organise lots of kind of events like this, working with young people across the region. David, when we get questions, would you prefer me to ask them as they come in, or would you want to wait to the end?
Yes, that's a good point. If I'll leave it up to you, Joe. If you think it's something that something I've missed and actually could really benefit from being highlighted there and then, please do interject. But otherwise, yes, we should have time at the end for questions. So do feel like you can store any up. But yeah, please do send us questions throughout, and Joe will interject or store them up and read them out to me when we need them, I guess. Okay. So without further ado, let's get going, I suppose. So yeah, so far I believe you had the introduction where you, if you were on that call, you might already have heard from me a little bit. Study and recall, student finance, which is a big topic, and hopefully you all found that quite useful. And then we have today, which is how to apply. So hopefully you should all be able to see the screen share on your screens. And I'm just going to maneuver Zoom out of the way so I can actually see it myself. There we go. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about how to apply to university. We are specifically talking about universities today. The process is very geared towards university applications and very centralized. There are obviously other forms of higher education and other things you can do. But the way that you go about doing those would be quite different. So we are just going to be concentrating on university. In the UK, applying to university means dealing with UCAS. UCAS are the central system that handle almost everything to do with university applications in the UK. There are some fringe ways of getting into university which would not involve going through UCAS, but most applications to university, the vast majority of them will be done through UCAS. I believe it used to stand for University and College Application Service, though I think they dropped that a while ago and they just call themselves UCAS these days. They are kind of a one-stop system, as we'll see throughout this this talk. You could do your entirety of your research and application process just using UCAS. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could do that. You have a lot on there. Alice, when you came to apply, had you heard of UCAS before? Was it something you were aware of, or was it something that was like, oh, what is this thing and how do I deal with it?
Yeah, I'd sort of heard they were kind of phrased like horror stories from the year above me when everyone had left the application to the final minute and we're going, UCAS, oh gosh, we need to figure out what this website is. And when it came around to my turn, I thought, oh, I don't want to be like that. I want to know what's going on beforehand. So yeah, I very faintly heard of it, but it was a very foreign concept when it was introduced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a pretty common story. Most people don't have to worry about it until they have to worry about it. It is worth, like you're doing today, find out some information ahead of time so that you're prepared and eyes open going into it. Joe, you unmuted. Did you have something to say, or was that just next? Okay, sorry, just putting you on the spot there. Okay, so obviously you all might be in different stages with your young person. Some of you might already be in progress with applications and so forth, or thinking for immediate entry. Some of you might be thinking for further down the line. For the purposes of today's session, I'm going to be talking about it as if you were planning to apply for 2023 entry, okay? We'll see that there's a timeline, and the red dot is us. So at this point, UCAS course search has gone live already, so that you can now go on the UCAS website and use it to look up courses that will be available for 2023 entry. When we say 2023 entry, that just means going to university to start in 2023. These dates do tend to be pretty similar year on year. So the dates for 2023 entry are basically just one day shifted from 2022 entry, and that was pretty similar to 2021 and so forth. So the dates do tend to sort of stay pretty much similar, although they will flex a little bit each year. And sometimes if there's a major change in something to do with, say, finance, or the way the qualifications are being looked at, there might entail a bigger change. So if you're looking at applying in a couple of years later than now, it's always worth just sort of checking out the dates and making sure there's nothing that's changed since then. So yeah, so we're at the end of April, if I'm not mistaken. At this point, you could, on the UCAS website, you could look up courses that are available from UK universities right now, and find out information about them and start sort of putting together information about what you might want to do. Next month, so mid next month, the application process will open. That doesn't mean you need to get your application in anytime soon. What that simply means is that the system is available for you to get on and for you to start putting your details in and making sure you're all registered. Alice, from talking to you, I think you're quite put together. I think you probably were on it on like the 16th of May when you came to apply. Is that fair to say?
I'd say summertime definitely. I knew it was law for me, but I spent the summer visiting universities, exploring what my options were, and then I started to get onto it a bit more in like August. I do, however, have friends who it opens in May and a deadline in January, and they did their application on the day before in January. So yeah, I think there's definitely different ways of approaching this, but you always 100%. End up on the right path. It doesn't matter whether you're very organized, but I would recommend that because it's a lot less stress when it comes to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure Joe will attest as well that going to schools and talking to lots of young people, those stories are not uncommon. And it's not uncommon for a teacher to sort of say, oh yeah, so you know how the applications end tomorrow? So and so over there has decided today they want to apply for a course. Can you help them? And of course we do if we can, but they're pretty common. Joe, do you have any sort of similar?
Yeah, I would just say probably the majority kind of that first term back, so kind of September, October time. I think that's when the majority work with their schools and get the applications, and that's when I'm certainly most busy in my schools, going out and working with students on their applications.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll see that with the timeline now. So the application process will open for 2023 entry mid next month. Following that, you can start completing your applications from September. So you'll see there's quite a big window there where it's just about getting the application basics in. I would always recommend having your young person get up and registered on the system as soon as possible. And we'll see what that entails later on in this talk. But you can't even submit until September. As Joe was saying, most people don't submit even then. Most people will be working with their teachers and their schools or the colleges at that point to prepare an application for submission. So moving on, here's the first proper deadline. So 15th of October, and it's usually around about the 15th of October year on year. We have the first deadline, and that's for a very specific set of courses. So it's for anybody who wants to study medicine, veterinary medicine to become a vet, or to do dentistry. It also includes anyone who wants to apply for courses at Oxford or Cambridge. Okay. So for those sets of courses, there is a separate deadline that is much earlier than the other subjects. And it's worth, if your young person is interested in any of these subjects, you do need to be much more on top of it than you would be elsewhere. You need to make sure your school is aware that you are interested in those things, or your college, and that they are prepared and ready to support you to get you into that. Obviously, Alice, who's with us today, did have to go through this process because she is at Oxford, which has this sort of specialist sort of thing. So you knew from the start you wanted to study law, right? But you applied to several universities, is that correct? So at what point did you decide Oxford, and how did that change the way that you went ahead planning this sort of process?
Yeah, I was very aware of law for many years before I even got to the point of applying to university. I'm very good at arguing, so it was a bit of a giveaway. I actually only thought of Oxford. My school very much tried to push me and thought was going, we think that you'd really like it. And they took me down on a trip, and I thought, well, I'll get out of double science for a day. This will be brilliant. And then I actually really fell in love with the city and the way things ran here. So yeah, I'd say my thoughts started in like July, which isn't uncommon, but there's a whole range of, if you think to go to Oxford or Cambridge, people can start thinking about this years in advance, or they can start thinking about it the month before the deadline. And I would also say, for me, I applied mostly to northern universities. I applied to University of Durham, I applied to University of Newcastle, to Leeds. I was very determined to stay in the north and at home, and it was only the slight push from my school that made me swap out Manchester for Oxford and think, okay, I can give the south a go. So,
and I think that also brings up an important point, that just because you're choosing one of these mix, so a course in medicine or dentistry or Oxford or Cambridge, doesn't mean you can't make other choices as well. Just as Alice was looking at other universities around as well, she wasn't just confined to applying for us.
The relevant question in the chat, somebody's asking if you start applying after A-level results.
Oh, we'll come to that, don't worry. Okay. So hold on to that one for now, and we'll come around to that further down the line. Okay.
I'd also add, in terms of like medicine and veterinary and science, just an anecdote. I did have a friend who was always very interested in these things, but wasn't too sure about university, didn't want to commit, decided after the deadline that that's the career path that she wanted to go down. And she actually looked at very similar courses which had a later deadline. She's now studying biomedical sciences.
Yeah.
So she's got a plan to go on and do an extra degree to go into medicine. So even if this deadline's missed and say a young person decides in December, oh, medicine's the one for them, you can always wait till next year, or you can go for a similar course and move on from there.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah. So after the 15th of October, where we have our first deadline, the next big deadline is the 25th of January. And it is normally towards the end of January. And that is called the Equal Consideration Application Deadline, which is a real big mouthful, but basically it means the deadline for applying for most courses in the UK in order to be considered equally. So all that means is that up until that date, universities will have to look at your application fairly and on an equal basis. So it doesn't matter whether you've submitted it in September or October or January, as long as you've got it in by that date, the university or universities that you've applied to will look at your application completely fairly and without any kind of prejudice for when you've got it in. If you get it into them after that date, so say the 26th of January, they don't have to do that. They can choose to, but they don't have to look at your application equally. They can sort of basically put you on a wait list, or they can refuse to look at your application whatsoever. So for most people, the January deadline is the really important one to bear in mind and work towards. Then after that, in February, something called UCAS Extra opens. We'll come back on around to talking about that later. And that has a deadline at the end of June. But basically, this is one of the extra rounds of applications you can make in conjunction with something else that we will also discuss later called clearing. And that would probably answer, Joe, the question you were that you read out from the chat around what to do after applications. So after results day. And then basically you're building towards the 18th of August when you'll have A-level results day. Obviously, if you're a young person studying alternative, so if you're a young person's studying equivalent subjects as well, so qualifications, that's the word, then there can sometimes be different results days, but it's usually around about then, and that's when your young person will basically find out what offers they've got, so what places they've got as a result of the offers they've had. So the first step to do is obviously to find out where you might want to go. I won't go on about this at huge length because we've already covered some of it in the course of this supporting parents and carers in education program. But just to sort of reiterate a few key things that you need to consider about are things like location. As you've heard, Alice was mostly looking at universities across the north. It's quite common that people will basically look at universities in about an hour and a half to 2 hours of their home base. It's kind of far enough away that your young person won't have to worry about their parents just turning up and announced, but close enough that they can get the laundry back to you on the weekend if they don't want to have space doing it themselves. Obviously, some people might look at staying in their hometown. I've also had friends who basically was like, how far away can I go? Love my family, but I'd like to go somewhere different, and that's was the basis of some of their sort of decision making. You might want to consider obviously what courses are available where. UCAS has search functions on their website. I won't show you that today. They are fairly sort of self-explanatory, and you can basically just type in subjects you are interested in. There are other services out there to help you sort of discover what might be out there as well. Things like Discover Uni and other websites that will sort of like help take what your young person is studying at A-level, or maybe what they're interested in, and work out what they might want to do. Your young person and yourselves should probably be considering what sort of teaching mix is at that university. So, and for that particular course, so will it be heavily based around lectures? Will it be, will it be a lot of self-directed learning? Sort of how will they go about teaching your young person, and what sort of self-discipline might they have to do? Will they have to be getting up early in the morning? It does make a difference to freshers in particular, and yeah, how that's going to work for the courses that you're looking at. Another thing to consider as well is tariffs. So basically, universities will say we want a certain number of points each qualification the young person is studying for will attract a certain number of points based on what they get. Okay, I won't go into all the details around like what different grades attract and so forth, just because we'll be here all day talking about the maths and it's not very fun. But if you look at the UCAS website, there's plenty of information there about tariffs. Joe, did you have something to say? Oh, sorry.
No, sorry.
No, I'm just seeing you unmuted and assuming. Sorry,
just quiet here, so I kept myself unmuted.
That's okay. So once you or your young person, or you and your young person have decided where you might want to go, you then need to sort of do several steps in order to make sure that you are sort of moving along that timeline at the right pace. So applications are normally done online. There is, I believe, still the opportunity to get a paper application. They're not very often done, and you normally need an extenuating reason why you need to do a paper application. And trust me, they are lengthy applications to do by paper, and it's much better to do online. But as a result, that means you need to register with UCAS Hub. You set up a username and password. It's pretty simple. Your young person needs to be the person doing this, though. It is their account. They can nominate you as someone who can represent them on their behalf and have access to certain information, but they are considered to be their own people. They are, looking to be moving into adulthood, and so they are the people who need to be doing this themselves. Alice, when you were looking to apply with your guardian, were you in the position of nominating them, or did they just sort of trust you to sort of take care of this themselves?
Yeah, she mostly trusted me to get through the details and things on my own, in terms of like, what's my name, what's my date of birth, those kinds of things that I fill in most days now. In terms of where she did help me with my application was in the more kind of substantive areas, in terms of putting across to universities why I want to study law, and just kind of helping me verbalize that, like having she used to read very helpfully on my guidance. She used to pick out a news story every week or two that was to do with law and try and understand it, and then turn to me and say, oh, I read about this, what do you think? And we'd have a 5-minute conversation, and some of those things actually made it into my application that I was writing. So that's mainly the way she supported me in this.
We'll come on to some of that a little bit down the line, in terms of like how to sort of show those things. But actually, that's a really good way of keeping a young person engaged throughout, and sort of like keeping them sort of like bubbling along, and reminding them that they are in the middle of this process, and they maybe need to be filling out the basics and ready.
I would say to keep a note of their password. Many people in my experience lose their passwords, and then usually turn to a teacher or a guardian and go, do you know? So
that can be especially problematic if you've maybe set it up in May and then haven't actually touched it until 2 days before the application deadline, and then rush to do it. That is a very good tip. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so once you've got set up, you normally have 5 choices, unless you're studying to medicine, veterinary medicine, or science and dentistry, in which case you have 4 choices. With those choices, the advice is normally to maybe sort of pick a couple that you're quite confident with, maybe pick one which is a bit of a backup, what happens if I don't get the results I'm hoping to get, and maybe pick one which is a little bit like, what happens if I do way better than I'm expecting, or I don't think I would get into there, but it would be amazing if I did. So it's always worth, with your choices, sort of thinking strategically, thinking, what could I do? Sorry about the noise. What could I do if I achieved that sort of like impossible goal? But also, what would happen if maybe I didn't get the results I wanted? And because you've got up to 5 choices, you have enough to play with there in order to achieve that, really. One thing to be aware of is that students can't apply to both Oxford and Cambridge. You do need to pick one of those, and you can't apply to multiple courses at either of those. Ordinarily, if you're applying to, say, Cardiff or Liverpool or so forth, you can apply to 5 different courses all at the same university, but that's not the case for those 2. There is a fee to submit your application. So for 2023, it will cost £22.50 to do one choice, or it will cost £27 for more than one, up to 5 choices. Okay, they do have some guidance on the UCAS website about paying for it if you're struggling. Certain groups, such as those in care or care leavers, might have their fees waived for them. Ordinarily, though, the UCAS encourage you to speak to your school or college in order to get some help. So yeah, just be aware that there is a little bit of a fee. It's not a lot, but obviously, if you are in financial difficulty, it is something to consider ahead of time. Just make sure that you're not going to be sort of shocked by that when it comes to the point of paying. But the most you will pay in any given year to apply is £27. Okay, you won't be charged £22 per application. Say it's just £27. So yeah, as we said, that there's this equal consideration deadline. That's the really important one to be aware of. It doesn't prevent applications from being considered before that deadline. It just makes sure that no application received within that period will be rejected purely on the grounds it was received after others in that period. Okay, so as long as you get it in by the equal consideration deadline, they will look at your application basically. Another thing to know as well is that providers won't be able to see what your what other courses or providers your young person has applied to. So you don't need to worry about like annoying one institution by applying to a different institution. All they'll be able to see is the application that comes through to them, not where else they might have applied to. Yeah, we've already covered a bit about registering. I won't go into too much details, but basically get your young person on the UCAS Hub, get them registered for an account. You can just go into the applications tile and then click start application as soon as the application process is open. If your young person is at a school or college, they will almost certainly have a buzzword, okay? So they just need to make sure that they are linking their account to their school using that buzzword. That is part of how your teachers will be able to do things like, their teachers will be able to do things like send in references and so forth, and help to manage the process of making that application. So it's quite important that your young person is aware in the right time frame of what the buzzword is and does link the school together. It's basically just a code word. And by linking your application, your young person will be giving your school or college permission to view and track that application as well. This is really, really useful to do. Most schools and colleges have really dedicated members of staff who genuinely want their students to achieve and have a lot of wealth of knowledge around the application process. And wherever possible, you do want your young person to have someone looking over their application and basically just making sure that it's in the place it needs to be when it needs to be there. That also means that they can provide the reference and send your application into UCAS on your behalf when it comes time to submit it. So there's a whole bunch of different things that your young person will need to ensure is filled out. They include personal details, contact information, the usual sort of stuff like that. There's space to put in work experience. Obviously, you don't have to have work experience, but it can be useful in showing some of the sort of transferable skills that your young person might have that might be illustrative when it comes to a member of staff looking it over and considering what sort of person your young person is. Education is obviously very important. Most people applying to university in the UK won't already have their qualifications for A-level or BTEC or equivalents. So you'll normally be putting in what you're studying, and your teachers will provide expected grades, and decisions will be made in the initial stages on the basis of that. But you will have space to put in what you achieved at GCSE and so forth. GCSE isn't always the be-all and end-all, and isn't always fully looked at by universities. It is increasingly something that is being looked at as more young people get good grades and study higher as well, and you have more people applying to universities. The space to put in about English language skills, basically, do you have that sort of like minimum qualification, minimum proficiency? To provide any supporting information, to provide a personal statement. Alice was talking a little bit around that before about sort of illustrating what you're interested in, and we're going to talk a bit more about the personal statement next. And then space to give those 5 choices, or 4 if you're applying to the early entry. There's space for references to be added. The references won't be visible to students, so your young person will not be able to see the reference submitted by their teacher. Okay, it's meant to be blind so that there's this element of fairness. In theory, that means that the teacher could say, oh, this student is rubbish. Obviously, no teacher ever does that. Teachers are always looking out to represent their students in the best light, and so forth. There's information to put, there's space to put information about finance and funding. Finance is in particular something where your young person will need your support, because you might need to divulge information around your own financial situation in order to get the application data in, because the system basically needs, for student finance, as you will probably have been hearing about last week or last session, they need to know your financial situation and decide about funding and so forth. And finally, there's a diversity and inclusion section. That won't prejudice any applications. That's just like part of the state's monitoring of who's applying and who's being given offers and so forth, so that we can sort of try and improve the service and try and make sure that we are having a fairer society, basically. Okay, so your young person sort of gets that all together, gets the application in. What the universities will look at are certain things. So they will be looking at the personal statement, okay? The personal statement will be covering in a little bit more detail next. They'll be looking at what qualifications your young person has, what qualifications they're currently studying for, and what they're expected to get. And they will also be considering your reference, okay? So by and large, all courses that your young person might apply to will think about these things in order to make decisions around who they are going to make offers to. They might also ask for additional things. They might ask you to undertake an admissions test. They might ask you to undertake an interview. And sorry, when I say you, I mean your young person, sorry. And certain courses might also require a portfolio or audition. That normally means those in performing arts, things like photography, things like other sort of arts-based fine arts and so forth, where portfolios are pretty standard, theatre and the like. Most courses won't require additional testing or interviews, but some do. It's quite common for certain subject areas, and also some universities, it's quite common for them to do. Oxford tend to do both of these things as pretty standard. Alice, obviously you're studying at Oxford, so you've sort of seen a bit of this. Would you like to just sort of tell us about how that looked for you, what it was about, and what they were looking for?
Yeah, so from the outset, it was incredibly terrifying going in. I think everyone can relate to like the nerves of before an interview and before a big test, and especially for something that's quite an important kind of decision in a young person's life. However, I do think going into it, the admissions test, if your young person has to sit one, there's usually a lot of online resources and support that can be found. Sometimes you may have to pay, but for example, you can get help from the school to get these resources, or often the websites themselves will have some form of support in terms of financing those resources, though I got by just fine on the free ones. And interviews, generally just having a love of your subject, I think, is all that you really need when you go into a university admissions interview. I quite honestly can say that in my own interviews, I fumbled, stumbled, quite literally fell over in front of the person who now teaches me. I know one question in particular was an icebreaker question, not testing, not needed for my course, just, oh, you did some work experience, how did you find it? And I was so nervous, I was just like, oh God, the paperwork was horrible and there was ink everywhere and it was a cramped office. And I mean, it made them laugh and I'm still here. But I'd say nerves is definitely a completely normal thing around these, but there's some research that can be done, and yeah, at the end of the day, it's all contributing towards a young person's future. And if they're going into something that they're passionate about wanting to do, or that they're fairly certain they'd be quite happy studying for a few years, they should be just fine.
Yeah. When way back when I was first applying for university, I actively avoided any university which did interviews. Over time, I sort of learned that was a mistake, and that was just that I was sort of like nervous and lacking in confidence as a young person. And the more I hang around universities and the further I went in terms of academic career, the more I learned that basically all anyone doing these interviews are looking for is just they want to know that you are the sort of person, or your young person will be the sort of person who will flourish on the course, that they won't be sort of set up for failure, and or that they're the sort of person that, you know, they could have a chat about what you both love in terms of subjects. And that's really that's all any academic really wants in life. And that's kind of what the interviews are for. And they're not meant to be terrifying by and large, and they are actually sort of like designed to sort of give a sort of a bit of insight, and they're sort of the academics who will be given the interviews know that young people will be nervous, and they take that into account. You know, they're not setting them for failure.
I would also say, I know for me, I came out of my interview still very nervous, but I was ecstatic because I'd got to speak about something that I was really interested in with somebody who was equally interested for about 20 minutes. And for me, going through that process, it was scary, but it's also very much confirmed I'm doing the thing that I think I should be doing. I had a very similar situation helping a friend who was applying for fashion, and she was making me whole bits and bobs while she put together a portfolio. And the amount of struggle that she had with piecing things together and color coordinating and just generally being very negative about the process. I know a few of us actually proposed, we said, oh, why don't you try putting together some of your artwork and see what happens? And it came together within an hour and a half. And sure enough, she decided to apply for art instead. So
yeah, it can be quite illustrative. You have to find what you love when you're doing these things, otherwise they won't work. Cool, excellent. So that's what the universities are looking for sort of overall. So in more sort of detail, what they are looking for is, as Alice was saying, have you chosen the right subject for the right reasons? Okay. Obviously, we all know that some people will really justifiably undertake a subject because they want to have a career afterwards, and they might be motivated by the fact that that career might have a bit of lucrative sort of options available to it. But more than that, you need to still have the drive to complete the course. University courses do take a lot of dedication. They do take a lot of work. They do take a lot of passion and drive to get through. And if your young person isn't interested in that subject area, they're only interested in an outcome, it's much more difficult to get through that process. They might be interested to know whether you can survive in sort of intensity of environment. Do you have a range of interests and aptitudes that contribute to your ability to get through that course? Do you have a sort of depth of knowledge in your subject? They won't expect your young person to know everything about the subject, because if your young person did, they don't need to go to university. They already know it. But what they want to know is that there has been sort of drive. Maybe there might have been some independent study. As Alice was saying, her guardian was reading out different articles to her so they could chat on a weekly basis. And that sort of builds up that depth of knowledge. Otherwise, some students might do background reading and all those sorts of things just to make sure that they have sort of like that depth and breadth of things that they're bringing to the subject before they study it at university. Do you appear motivated and committed? That might mean in some circumstances undertaking weekend work or work experience placements or other sort of like voluntary things or paid work in order to be exposed more to that subject area. That's particularly so for highly competitive courses. So for things like medicine, for example. So a couple of years ago, I was at the UCAS headquarters, and one of the sort of like managers there was chatting to us, and gave a couple of real examples that had come up in his experience. And you had a person who came from a background, they didn't have very much money, they couldn't sort of like, he didn't have enough money to sort of go on gap year and sort of build a school in Kenya or whatnot. But what he did do is he worked in a hospital doing the terrible jobs, cleaning up, mess, tidying up blood, carting people around, lifting heavy things, all the things that like they didn't pay well. It wasn't pleasant, but when it came to application time, he was a really good candidate compared to those who'd gone on gap year and done this sort of school building and all that kind of stuff, because he'd shown that he had that drive, that passion, and he'd experienced some of the worst of what being a nurse could be, and had sort of like still come out of it knowing it's what he wanted to do, and he was able to really passionately sort of give that narrative when it came to writing his application. And yeah, so that's kind of like what they're looking for. So Alice, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, specifically, for example, if a young person's thinking about a course where work experience maybe isn't too accessible, even if it is the nitty-gritty jobs, or if, work experience is something that's not available for whatever reason, there are other options. I know for me, I found a podcast on the BBC that discussed a few things about law. I got my Guardian to read news articles, just everyday average Guardian articles that I could then talk about. And that was more than enough. There's also online work experience now, which is still a surprise for many students that I speak to, but it has made a lot of the kind of inaccessible professions slightly more accessible. So yeah, there's a range of things that can be done.
Yeah, and on top of the podcast issue as well, many universities and academics are now doing their own podcasts. So quite often you might find that someone in your young person's area of interest might have YouTube or a podcast series or something similar that they put out, maybe even an academic in the department they want to apply to. Likewise as well, universities will all offer public talks, or they might offer public school focused conferences and so forth, and it can be a really good experience to attend those either in person if you can, or digitally as well, because many of them are now live streaming those at the same time, and that's a really good way of being able to show that you're interested in studying something at university, because as a young person you've elected to go to the university and sort of like experience it in some kind of way. There can be this sort of like narrative around presenting yourself as a well-rounded applicant. There is a quote that I really love from one of our admissions tutors, I think at Brasenose College at Oxford, and he said, "We don't care, as long as you can be as flat as you like, flat as a pancake, so long as you're good at the subject." Okay, so like it is valuable to come across as a real person as an applicant, to show a range of interests, to show that you have experiences and that you've done things and you have knowledge and sort of like lots of different things like that. The key thing though is that wherever possible, those things should be related to the course you're applying to, because that will always be more impressive than having a whole string of things you've done that are completely irrelevant, and it's like, so what? So yeah, just to say, like, keep focused on that. What is your young person applying to, and how are you going to go about doing it? But different universities will have different approaches. It is worthwhile having a look at their websites. They will give you guidance, and sometimes that guidance might be at course level, or sometimes it might be at university level. Oxford has a highly academical approach, but some other departments and some other universities might be more interested in personal experience, particularly if they're a course that tends to attract and have really strong candidates who have come from alternative backgrounds and so forth. So it's always worth looking into that. It's always worth asking about that sort of thing on university open days, or even ringing up the department and asking to speak to the admissions tutor, that kind of thing. because they can give you advice around that. Most of this will come across in the personal statement. Most of this sort of drive, the passion, and what your young person is interested in is sort of embodied in the personal statement. It's the only section that they will have full control over. They don't get to see the reference at all. The only way they can control that is by being nice to the teacher who's going to write the application and making sure that they're going to include the right things and know enough about your young person to write a good application. But the personal statement is something that they will write themselves and have full control over. It's the only chance to really market yourself as an individual, not just a list of qualifications and so forth. You can only submit one personal statement through UCAS, but there is an alternative, and this is something that UCAS themselves encourage people to consider, but most people don't know it's an option. If your young person is considering applying to very different courses, maybe they might be looking at English in one university, but something very different like mathematics in a different one, that personal statement might not be very effective looking at both of those, okay? Either you're gonna have to target one of them and then have a rubbish application for the other, or you're gonna have to try and sort of like get an application that sort of addressed both, and it's not gonna be very strong for either of them. What you can suggest is that basically you or your young person, ideally your young person, but you know, most tutors will understand parents or guardians or carers getting in touch on their behalf. The solution is to ask the university, would you accept an alternative email to you directly? Many universities will. Most of the time, admissions tutors are looking to get the best information, the best overview of their applicants possible. And if that means receiving a separate personal statement not sent via UCAS, most of the time they're happy with that, or at least some of the time. They can say no, but the worst that can happen is that they can say no, okay? So do bear that in mind if your young person is thinking of very different choices. There is a maximum of 4,000 characters or 47 lines of text, okay? That characters will include punctuation, it will include spaces, okay? It's quite a lot when you've got a blank piece of paper or a blank Word document, but it does fill up quite fast. And ideally, your young person will be doing a lot of editing and a lot of cutting in order to get it down to the right length. There is a minimum of 1,000 characters. If your young person hasn't written that much, it's not going to be a very good application anyway. But that will fill up very, very quickly. There isn't a spelling or grammar check on the UCAS website. The normal recommendation is to write it separately in something like Word, where you can do spell checking, and then paste it in. Just be aware that there's no formatting allowed on UCAS. So if there's any underlinings and bolds or any sort of like more esoteric punctuation marks and so forth used, that might be lost. So it needs to be very thoroughly checked over before it's submitted. It is run through a detection service, similar to the way that assessments might be run through detection services, particularly at university. They all use these plagiarism checks these days. So just make sure that your young person is genuinely writing it themselves, okay? Can be scary to start off with, but the worst thing they can do is start off with someone else's template or crib from someone else's work, and perhaps accidentally end up writing or including parts of it which isn't their own and flags as a plagiarism issue. You should be aware of autocorrect. You should make sure that these are all examples from UCAS. I should say these are all real examples which have been caught in student applications. So no catch-12 situations, when it should say catch-22. No thinking of yourselves as a warm-hearted individual, not quite a good thing. English is like a second language to I. Clearly someone trying to write a little bit fancy and maybe not quite getting the grammar right. And twice a week I attend marital arts classes. So make sure that your young person is communicating what they want to do. Do encourage them to show maybe yourself or maybe their friends, maybe teachers, whoever they can, as many people as they can, and be critical. Genuinely look at it and suggest areas that they can fix. Make sure that you are reading it through word by word. Make sure that the tone isn't accidentally hitting the wrong mark. I would always encourage that the opening line is written last, okay? Your young person should never sit there for weeks looking at a blank piece of paper or a blank Word document, trying to think of the perfect opening line. It doesn't matter. Get them to write down the bullet points first, flesh it out. Once they've written the whole thing, they can go back and fill in the opening line last, because it doesn't need to be written in the order that it will be read. Part of the reason I say that is because there are a list of very common opening lines. So these are statistics, I think they were from 2016, maybe I've forgotten which year they're from. Sorry, 2015, they're from 2015 application cycle. So we had, UCAS had 1,779 people sending in a near identical first line. Imagine if you're looking at these applications, you're seeing the same thing year on year on year. So don't worry about sort of having that very, very sort of pithy opening. You don't need to say nursing is a very challenging and demanding career. They know. You don't need to say I've always been passionate about this thing. Demonstrate it. And most of all, never ever start with a quote. So in 2015, 148 people started with the identical quote from Nelson Mandela, because they thought it would seem like an impressive and erudite way of starting their application. All they've actually done is they've wasted characters on someone else's words when they could have been using their own. Okay, so get your young person to write it from scratch, draft it again and again, and edit it very, very thoroughly. Alice, earlier we were talking, I think you did 3 drafts, but probably about 3 million edits. For some people, it might be 20 drafts and so forth.
I did 3. One of my best friends did 6. The other one did 22. So there's a whole range. I would say, oh, sorry, I was going to say, in relation to the personal statement, a really good piece of advice that I got from a teacher in starting the personal statement was think of where your interest began. And she said, do it very simply. She was the careers advisor at school. She said, do it like a job application. The 3 W's is what we called it. It was, what do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? And what have you done about this? Which I found was the best advice I think I've had. And I've used that in job applications. I've used that in internship applications. And for me, it never fails. And I think it really helps us stay away from the stereotypical. I have been interested in this since I was 3 years old, which I was not interested in law at 3 years old.
No, you'd be a weird child if you were. Having a 3-year-old myself, and that is a very, very key point. Like do encourage a young person to use those resources, use those teachers, those career advisors who are in many cases highly motivated and highly knowledgeable and really know what they're talking about, and encourage your young person not to be shy and to approach them, because it can only help their application. I'll sort of skip over this, but basically try and encourage a young person to be effective and economical with their words. So there can be a tendency to try and show how erudite you are by using many fancy words and so forth, when actually what is more effective is to say what you mean to say. Okay, so but there's plenty of advice out there about how to write your personal statement. Okay, so if we return to the timeline, okay, so the timeline for 2023, your young person will have that opportunity up until January to get all this information in, to get the UCAS, all the sort of background information, to get the personal statements in. They will also have to have got their whatever teacher's writing the reference to have committed to doing so. That then gets submitted, and it's open for consideration from that point. Universities can decline your application. They can accept it unconditionally, or they can accept it conditionally. So unconditionally means, yeah, great, we'll have you whatever. The government has been discouraging universities from using unconditional offers so much recently, so their usage has declined a little bit, but they still do exist, and it's a very good position to be in. Just make sure your young person is still, putting the work in order to get through their courses before they start, without that sort of motivation. If they have a conditional offer, that will normally state what they need to achieve, either what grades they need or what tariff points they need to achieve in order to get in. If your young person then achieves those at results day, then they're in. That's great, you're done. There are a couple of other options as well, though, so which we'll come on to in a minute in terms of extra and clearing. We have a couple of minutes left and we should be able to get onto those. So then basically after that, it's basically keep your young person going through their course, get them to do their exams, get them to do their revision, get them to sort of get all that out of the way, and then wait for results day and try and support them as much as you can. They might be a bit nervous about it. On the day, make sure that your young person has their application details handy, including the password, like Alice said earlier. Make sure that contact details are up to date as well, okay? Because you'll need those in order to be able to receive offers. And also that if you need to chase anything or follow up or do any actions, you need to be prepared for those things. There's nothing worse than feeling impotent because you can't do anything because you haven't got the right details to hand. You need to make sure that your young person is ready and available on results day as far as possible. They can give you nominated access, but if they don't, they're expected to manage their application themselves and to speak for themselves, okay? So if they're going to want you to support them, maybe get them to give you nominated access, but make sure that they are themselves ready and willing to step in. Check how your exam results get to university or college that you're applying to. Most of the time, and for the vast majority of courses that you might do, say at A-level and so forth, it'll be sent through automatically. But it's just worth making sure that if your young person is doing any more esoteric or unusual courses or qualifications, that you're aware that it will be sent in and you don't need to send them in yourself. As we said, yes, you might get an unconditional or a conditional offer at that point. You might get a changed course offer as well. So you might have the option to undertake a different course. So say you've applied, your young person's applied to do a particular thing, but actually so many people achieved their conditional offers for that subject that they couldn't get in, that your young person couldn't get in. But there's a very similar course from the same department that actually shares a lot of the same academic staff and has a lot of the same syllabus, but diverges in a couple of ways. And maybe from year 2, you can just switch program anyway. So they might offer you that instead. So be prepared and ready to get online and check out information about those courses and be prepared to accept or decline them quite promptly because you might not have forever to do it. You might find that there's none showing in your application manager on the UCAS website. So just be prepared to make contact and ask your universities about that if you haven't got any results showing. So make sure you've got their phone numbers and so forth at hand. There are exam reviews and appeals processes in place if your young person feels like they should have done better and that they were in some ways unfairly treated, or those mitigating processes. But basically, at that point, most people will be in the position of knowing where they're going to study because they'll have been accepted or declined. You don't have to go, obviously, as a young person. You're not sort of indentured, so you can still choose not to, but most people will go on to do what they've are asked to do. And you will get a notification from UCAS confirming what course you have been sort of accepted onto, and the university that you've been accepted to will then send you further information about joining. Keep your young person on the lookout for any information around bridging and transition, for anything they can do in the summer and the lead up, or anything that they can attend maybe that would get them prepared. But pretty much from there, it's down to the university to do it. If your young person didn't get what they want, okay, it is not the end of the world. They can speak to the university or college. Sometimes they can be flexible, especially if they only narrowly miss the offer. Maybe they're a couple of tariff points off. It is possible to appeal a grade. It's less usual to be successful that way, but it is possible if you've got genuine grounds to. But more than that, there are other options. So you can apply for clearing at that point. So if you find yourself in clearing, that means that you haven't been matched up with any courses, but universities across the country will still have course spaces available, and they will, be open for this further round of applications. And in many cases, actually, these are really good matches for people, and maybe they're courses that you wouldn't have been aware of beforehand. As I think one of your friends went through.
Yeah,
clearing, right?
I was going to mention my good friend who she ended up in clearing. She was really distraught. She was really upset. She'd had her heart set on one university, and we persuaded her and said, no, try this university. Look, there's University of Bangor and they're doing history. Why don't you try going there? She did. She was accepted through clearing, and now her family are actually planning to move to Wales permanently. So it really worked out in that case. I wouldn't say every case works out that well, but that was definitely the best decision I think she could have made that day.
Yeah, lovely. And that is the thing about it's a journey, and you don't know where you're going to end up necessarily. So we are just going to wrap up now. So it's not very, I'm aware of the time, and we are just going to very quickly just cover the last couple of points. So if your young person has got their application in time for January, maybe, or maybe missed the deadline, they can still put in an application. There's something called UCAS Extra. So that might be if you've used all of your choices and haven't had any offers, you can add in extra choices at that point. So if your young person puts in 5 applications and is declined for all of them, that's not the end of the world. There is still another chance to apply for further universities. They're not frozen out of the system. Like we just discussed, clearing is available after results day. And that is often the way that people then find their courses. On top of that, there is always the option of next year as well. It is always possible to get in. Sometimes actually universities will be quite keen to accept you as a guaranteed sort of unconditional offer in advance. Sometimes they can be more lenient because they're sort of willing for that. Okay, so that sort of wraps it up. I'm aware that many of you might need to head on off and carry on with your busy lives. Myself and Alice, I think we're prepared to stay behind and answer any questions. If you do need to leave now, thank you very much. I hope that you'll be joining us for the other sessions that are available as part of this thing. And thank you for your attention. And if you're going to stay with us now, then yeah, please do. So Jo, did we have any questions?
No, only the one which we've answered about applying about A-levels.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Which, yeah,
that's
basically, if it wasn't clear, you don't apply after A-level results, you apply kind of in the summer, autumn,
so the UK,
the start of
the
UK.
Year. Sorry, Jo, sorry, carry on. I spoke over you.
That's fine. That was it. I just said, yeah, between the summer and autumn of the start of your second year, isn't it? So A-levels, if your young person's
So the UK basically has a system where we have thousands of young people apply to university each year on the basis of best guesses, and then you find out what you've got, and that's when you find out whether or not you get accepted. There are continual movements and discussions around changing the system, changing when your results day is versus when you apply to what's called post-qualification applications, but this probably won't happen for many years if it ever does happen. If anybody has any other questions, please do pop them in the chat. We can also, I think, stop recording, I think, now, and if you want to ask something a bit more on a personal basis, then we can sort of, I think, unmute you and whatnot, but that's up to you.
Yeah, I'll stop the recording now. So if anybody else wants to ask questions, and then...
Thank you. And the question panel is also still open.